The year is 1905. The world is changing rapidly, but some things remain constant. The weight of tradition, the bonds of family, and the shadows that gather in the corners of grand old houses. In the quiet village of Thornfield, nestled in the English countryside, stands Blackwood Manor. Once the pride of the county, its stone facade has weathered with time, its gardens less immaculate than in years past. Yet it still commands respect, a testament to the family who has called it home for 3 generations. The Blackwoods were once among the wealthiest families in the region. Old money, they called it, the kind that builds empires and leaves legacies. But fortunes change, and the dawn of the new century has not been kind to the Blackwood name. Edward Blackwood, the current patriarch, sits in his study, fingers drumming against the polished mahogany of his desk. A once handsome man, now graying at the temples, his eyes still sharp despite the wrinkles that have formed at their corners. The Morning Post has brought news that his investments in the coal mines have suffered yet another setback. The world is turning to electricity now, to automobiles and telephones. Progress marches forward, leaving men like Edward Blackwood struggling to catch up. "Father," a soft voice breaks the silence. Edward looks up to see his eldest daughter, Charlotte, standing in the doorway. At 23, she is the spitting image of her mother, tall and elegant, with dark hair coiled neatly atop her head. "Mother sent me to remind you that the photographer will be arriving at 2 o'clock. She insists that you not be late this time." Edward sighs, tucking the financial papers into a drawer. Yes, I remember, though I cannot fathom why Eleanor insists on this portrait now, of all times. "It's her birthday gift, Father," Charlotte reminds him gently. "And it has been nearly 5 years since our last family portrait. William was just a boy then." At the mention of his son, Edward's expression softens. "Very well. Tell your mother I shall be punctual." Charlotte nods, but hesitates before leaving. "Is everything all right, Father? You seem troubled." Edward forces a smile. "Merely business matters, my dear. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." When Charlotte leaves, Edward unlocks the bottom drawer of his desk and withdraws a half-empty bottle of brandy. It's early for a drink, but these days, the hours between dawn and dusk seem increasingly difficult to navigate without something to dull the edges. Upstairs, Eleanor Blackwood stands before her wardrobe, fingers trailing over the fine fabrics of dresses that have fallen out of fashion years ago. At 45, she remains a beautiful woman, though the light in her eyes has dimmed somewhat in recent years. Marriage to Edward has not been the fairy tale her younger self had imagined. She selects a dark blue gown with intricate beadwork around the collar, one of her finest, saved for special occasions. Today is special, though not for the reasons she has told her family. Eleanor has her own motivations for commissioning this portrait, reasons she keeps close to her heart. In the room adjacent, 16-year-old William Blackwood adjusts his collar before the mirror, grimacing at his reflection. "Ridiculous," he mutters, tugging at the stiff fabric. Unlike his father and sister, William has inherited his mother's slighter build and fair complexion. The academic of the family, he prefers books to hunting and has little patience for social conventions. A knock at the door interrupts his struggle with the collar. "Enter," he calls, expecting his sister or perhaps the maid. Instead, a small face peeks around the edge of the door. His 9-year-old sister, Rose, already dressed in a white pinafore, her golden curls arranged with painstaking care. "Will you help me with my ribbon, William?" she asks, holding up a length of satin that matches the blue of her eyes. William's irritation melts away. Of all his family members, Rose is the one he feels most protective of, most connected to. "Come here then," he says, kneeling to tie the ribbon in her hair. "There. Perfect." Rose beams at him. "Are you excited about the photograph, William? Mother says we shall have it hung in the main hall, and that when people visit, they will see our faces and know what a fine family we are." William resists the urge to roll his eyes. "I'm sure they will, Rosie. Mr. Harrow says photographs capture more than just faces," Rose continues, referring to her tutor. "He says they capture souls." "Mr. Harrow has filled your head with nonsense," William replies, though a shiver runs through him at the words. "Photographs capture light and shadow, nothing more." Rose frowns. "But what about Great Aunt Agatha's photograph, the one where her eyes follow you around the room?" "An optical illusion," William insists, though he has always hurried past that particular portrait in the East Wing corridor. A bell rings downstairs, signaling the arrival of a visitor. Rose claps her hands. "That must be the photographer. Come, William." She grabs his hand, pulling him toward the door with surprising strength for one so small. Downstairs, Eleanor greets the photographer in the entrance hall. Theodore Fleming is a serious-looking man in his 40s with a meticulously trimmed beard and spectacles that catch the light as he moves. He has established himself as the premier portrait photographer in the county, his services sought after by the remaining gentry and the newly wealthy alike. "Mrs. Blackwood, a pleasure as always," he says, bowing slightly. Behind him, a young assistant struggles with the bulky camera equipment. "Mr. Fleming, thank you for accommodating us on such short notice," Eleanor replies. "I trust everything is in order." "Indeed, madam. I've brought my finest equipment, including the new German-made lens I mentioned in my letter. It captures detail most remarkably." He gestures to his assistant. "This is Thomas, my new apprentice. He will be assisting me today." Thomas, a gangly youth no older than 18, nods nervously. "An honor to meet you, ma'am." Eleanor acknowledges him with a brief smile before turning back to Fleming. "I was thinking the drawing room would be most suitable. The afternoon light is particularly fine there." "As you wish, Mrs. Blackwood. Though I had thought perhaps the grand staircase, as we discussed. The drawing room will be best," Eleanor interrupts, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The maid will show you the way. We shall join you shortly." As Fleming and his assistant are led away, Edward emerges from his study, straightening his waistcoat. "The photographer, I presume?" "Yes," Eleanor says. "Fleming. He comes highly recommended by the Harringtons." Edward makes a non-committal sound. "The Harringtons' extravagance is well known throughout the county." "And where is Charlotte?" "Here, father." Charlotte descends the stairs, a vision in emerald green, her mother's pearl necklace at her throat. Behind her come William and Rose, hand in hand. Edward surveys his family with an appraising eye. Despite their reduced circumstances, they still look every inch the prosperous family they once were. Appearances, after all, are everything. "Very well," he says. "Let us get this over with." The drawing room has been prepared for the occasion. Heavy velvet drapes have been drawn back to allow the afternoon sunlight to stream through the tall windows. The furniture has been rearranged, creating a space before the ornate fireplace where the family will pose. But it is the large gilt-framed mirror hanging above the mantelpiece that catches Eleanor's eye as they enter. An heirloom piece passed down through generations of Blackwoods. The glass is slightly clouded with age, the silvering beginning to deteriorate at the edges, creating a darkened border around the reflection. Fleming is already setting up his camera, directing Thomas in the placement of a backdrop, and adjusting the positions of several gas lamps to supplement the natural light. "Ah, the Blackwood family, complete at last," Fleming says, straightening up. "Shall we begin?" "I suggest Mrs. Blackwood seated in the center, with Miss Blackwood standing behind her right shoulder. Mr. Blackwood, if you would stand behind your wife's left shoulder, the young master can stand to his father's left, and the little miss to her sister's right." As the family takes their positions, Fleming disappears beneath the black cloth draped over the back of his camera, studying the composition through the lens. "A little to the left, Mr. Blackwood. Yes, that's it. Miss Charlotte, perhaps you could place your hand on your mother's shoulder. Perfect. Young master, chin up slightly. Excellent." Rose fidgets in her place, earning a stern look from her father. "Stand still, Rose," he murmurs. "The mirror is watching us." Rose whispers back, her eyes fixed on the glass above the mantelpiece. "Nonsense," Edward replies, but he cannot help glancing up at the mirror himself. For a moment he could swear he sees movement in its depths, a shadow that doesn't correspond to anyone in the room. But when he looks directly, there is only the faithful reflection of the scene, the photographer bent over his camera, Thomas standing attentively nearby, and the Blackwood family arranged before the fireplace. "Now, if everyone could remain perfectly still," Fleming instructs, emerging from beneath the cloth. "The exposure will take several seconds. Please do not move or blink." He turns to Thomas. "Remove the lens cap on my count." The family assumes their most dignified expressions. Eleanor's back is ramrod straight, a polite smile fixed on her lips. Edward stands tall, one hand resting on the back of his wife's chair. Charlotte's face is serene, her eyes soft. William attempts to look serious and scholarly, while Rose struggles to contain her natural exuberance. 3, 2, 1. Fleming counts down, and Thomas removes the cap from the lens. The seconds stretch into an eternity. Rose feels an itch on her nose but doesn't dare move. William's collar seems to tighten around his neck. Charlotte's smile begins to strain. Edward's thoughts drift back to the financial papers in his desk drawer, and Eleanor. Eleanor's eyes are drawn inexorably to the mirror, where someone, seems to be taking shape in the reflection, standing just behind William, a figure that is not present in the room. And done, Fleming announces as Thomas replaces the cap. Excellent. Let us take one more, to be certain we have a perfect image. They repeat the process twice more, the family holding their poses with increasing difficulty. Each time, Eleanor's gaze returns to the mirror, but the strange impression of an additional presence seems to have vanished. Perhaps it was merely a trick of the light, a momentary reflection from outside the window. That will do splendidly, Fleming declares after the third exposure. I shall develop these in my studio and bring you the proofs within the week. Then you can select which you prefer for the final portrait. As the family relaxes from their poses, Fleming begins to pack away his equipment. If I may say so, Mrs. Blackwood, you have a most photogenic family. The camera loves such fine features. Eleanor accepts the compliment with a gracious nod, but her attention remains on the mirror. There is something about it today, something different that she cannot quite place. Rose tugs at her mother's sleeve. Mama, did you see the man in the mirror? Eleanor's heart skips a beat. What man, darling? The one standing behind William. He was watching us. Edward overhears and frowns. Rose, that's quite enough of your imagination for one day. There was no man. Rose looks as though she might argue, but a warning glance from Charlotte silences her. William, however, has gone noticeably pale. Are you well, William? Charlotte asks, touching his arm. Yes, quite, he replies, though his voice lacks conviction. Just tired of standing, I suppose. As Fleming and Thomas take their leave, promising to return with the proofs, an uneasy silence falls over the Blackwood family. Each lost in their own thoughts, they disperse to their respective corners of the house. Only Eleanor remains in the drawing room, staring up at the mirror that has hung in Blackwood Manor for longer than she has been alive. What secrets do you hold? She whispers, reaching up to touch the cool glass. For a moment, just the briefest of moments, she thinks she sees a face looking back at her that is not her own. A man's face, gaunt and pale, with eyes that seem to burn with an inner light. Then it is gone, and there is only Eleanor Blackwood, her reflection wide-eyed and trembling. The days that follow pass in the usual routine of the Blackwood household. Edward spends long hours in his study, emerging only for meals, his expression growing increasingly grim. Charlotte manages the household affairs, stepping in where her mother seems distracted and absent-minded. William buries himself in his books, while Rose becomes uncharacteristically quiet, her usual exuberance dimmed. And Eleanor? Eleanor finds herself drawn repeatedly to the drawing room, to the mirror above the mantelpiece. Sometimes she sits for hours, watching the glass as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. The servants whisper among themselves, concerned about the mistress's strange behavior, but none dare approach her. It is on the 5th day after the photograph was taken that Fleming returns to Blackwood Manor. He is shown into the study where Edward is waiting, a glass of brandy in hand despite the early hour. Mr. Blackwood, Fleming greets him, opening his leather portfolio. I have the proofs for your consideration. I must say, they have turned out exceptionally well. Edward gestures for him to place them on the desk. My wife will make the final selection. She has the better eye for these matters. Fleming lays out 3 photographs, each showing the Blackwood family arranged before the fireplace. At first glance, they appear identical, the same poses, the same solemn expressions. But as Edward leans forward to examine them more closely, his blood runs cold. In each photograph, reflected in the mirror above the mantelpiece, is a 6th figure, a man, tall and thin, standing directly behind William, a man who was not present in the room when the photographs were taken. What is the meaning of this? Edward demands, his voice barely controlled. Is this some kind of trick, Fleming? The photographer looks confused. I'm sorry, sir? Edward jabs his finger at the reflection in the mirror. This person, who is this? Fleming peers at the photograph, adjusting his spectacles. His face drains of color. I don't understand, Mr. Blackwood. There was no one else in the room. Just your family, myself, and Thomas. Then how do you explain this? Edward pushes the photograph toward him. Fleming shakes his head, genuinely perplexed. I cannot, sir. Perhaps a flaw in the development process, a double exposure of some kind. In all 3 photographs? In exactly the same position? Edward's voice rises. Do you take me for a fool, Mr. Fleming? Of course not, sir. I assure you, I am as mystified as you are. Fleming's hands tremble slightly as he gathers the photographs. Perhaps if I take them back to the studio, examine them more closely. Leave them, Edward commands. And not a word of this to anyone, do you understand? Not to your assistant, not to the other families you serve. No one. Fleming nods, sweat beading on his forehead. As you wish, Mr. Blackwood. Shall I return at a later date to discuss the final selection? That will not be necessary. You will receive payment for your services, but we will not be requiring the finished portrait. Edward rises, indicating that the meeting is over. Good day, Mr. Fleming. When the photographer has gone, Edward remains standing behind his desk, staring down at the 3 photographs. Each shows the same inexplicable anomaly. 5 living Blackwoods and 1, what? A ghost? A trick of the light? Or something else entirely? With a shaking hand, Edward reaches for the brandy decanter. That evening, after dinner, Edward calls his family together in the drawing room. The photographs are laid out on a small table, and one by one, the Blackwoods lean in to examine them. Charlotte is the first to notice. Father, what is that? She asks, pointing to the mirror in the photograph. It looks like a person. That's the man I saw, Rose says quietly. The one behind William. William leans in closer, his face ashen. This isn't possible, he whispers. Only Eleanor remains calm, her eyes fixed not on the photographs but on the mirror itself. He's always been there, she says, her voice distant, watching us, waiting. Edward shoots his wife a sharp look. Eleanor, what are you talking about? She turns to him, her eyes strangely unfocused. The mirror, Edward. It's been in this house for generations. Did you never wonder why your father insisted it never be moved from this room? A chill runs down Edward's spine. His father had indeed been adamant about the mirror remaining above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He had attributed it to his father's notorious stubbornness, his resistance to any change in the house. It's just a mirror, Mother, Charlotte says gently, though her voice wavers. Is it? Eleanor approaches the mirror, standing directly before it. In the glass, her reflection stares back, but there seems to be something else in the depths of the mirror, a darkness that doesn't belong. I've felt his presence for years. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I began to see him, just glimpses at the corner of my eye. And now, she gestures to the photographs. Now we have proof. Proof of what, exactly? Edward demands, his rational mind rebelling against the direction this conversation is taking. That we are not alone in this house, Eleanor says simply. Rose moves closer to William, slipping her small hand into his. Is it a ghost, Mama? She asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Eleanor can answer, the gas lamps in the room flicker, the flames dancing as if caught in a sudden draft. The temperature seems to drop several degrees in an instant. This is absurd, Edward declares, though his voice lacks conviction. There is a logical explanation for the photographs. A fault in Fleming's equipment, or perhaps... Look, William interrupts, pointing at the mirror. They all turn to see what has caught his attention. At first, the mirror shows only their reflections, the 5 Blackwoods standing in a loose semicircle in the drawing room. But then, gradually, a darkness begins to form behind William's reflection, coalescing into the shape of a man. Rose lets out a small cry, burying her face in William's side. Charlotte takes an involuntary step backward. Edward remains frozen, unable to comprehend what he is seeing. Only Eleanor moves forward, approaching the mirror with an expression that mingles fear and fascination. Who are you? She whispers to the apparition. The figure in the mirror offers no response, but its presence seems to intensify, becoming more defined. It is a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in clothing that might have been fashionable decades ago. His face is partially obscured by shadow, but his eyes are clearly visible, dark, deep-set, and filled with an unreadable emotion. Eleanor, get away from there, Edward commands, finding his voice at last. She ignores him, reaching out to touch the surface of the mirror. As her fingers make contact with the glass, the lamps flicker again, more violently this time. One extinguishes entirely, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. Mother, please, Charlotte pleads, her composure cracking. Eleanor withdraws her hand and the remaining lamps stabilize, though they burn noticeably dimmer than before. The figure in the mirror has vanished, leaving only the normal reflections of the Blackwood family, their faces pale with shock. It's him, Eleanor says, turning back to her family. Richard Blackwood. Edward stares at his wife in disbelief. My great-uncle, the one who who disappeared without a trace in 1863. Eleanor finishes for him. Yes, William, always the scholar, is the first to recover his analytical faculties. How can you be sure it's him? Great-uncle Richard vanished before any of us were born. There's a miniature portrait of him in your father's study, Eleanor explains. I've studied it many times. The resemblance is unmistakable. Edward runs a hand through his graying hair, struggling to make sense of what is happening. This is madness. Richard Blackwood left the country after a disagreement with my grandfather. He went to America. That's what my father always said. Is that what he told you? Eleanor's laugh is hollow. Your father knew the truth, Edward, just as his father did. The knowledge has been passed down from one Blackwood patriarch to the next. I wasn't supposed to know, but your father spoke of it in his final days, when the fever took hold and loosened his tongue. Spoke of what? Charlotte asks, her voice barely audible. Eleanor looks at each of them in turn, her gaze finally settling on Edward. Richard Blackwood never left this house, at least, not alive. A heavy silence falls over the drawing room. Outside, clouds have gathered, blocking the moonlight that had been streaming through the windows. The house seems to hold its breath, waiting. What happened to him? William asks at last, his scholarly curiosity overcoming his fear. Eleanor turns back to the mirror, as if expecting to see the apparition again. Richard was the younger brother of Edward's grandfather, James Blackwood. He was brilliant but unstable, given to fits of melancholy and rage. When their father died, the estate passed to James, as was proper. Richard contested the will, claiming that James was unfit to manage the family's affairs. Edward nods slowly. This much he knew from family history, though the details had always been vague. The brothers' dispute grew increasingly bitter. Eleanor continues. Richard threatened to expose certain indiscretions of James's that would have ruined his reputation in society. Whether these accusations had any merit, I cannot say. But James took them seriously enough. Seriously enough to do what? Charlotte asks, though her expression suggests she already suspects the answer. To silence his brother permanently. Eleanor's voice has taken on a distant quality, as if she is reciting facts from a history book rather than describing a family tragedy. According to your grandfather on his deathbed, James confronted Richard in this very room. Their argument became heated. In a moment of rage, James struck his brother with a fireplace poker. Richard fell, striking his head on the hearth. He died instantly. Rose whimpers, pressing closer to William, who puts a protective arm around her shoulders. James panicked, Eleanor continues. With the help of a trusted servant, he concealed the body. Where? Edward asks, his voice hoarse. Eleanor gestures to the wall behind them, within the house itself, behind the paneling in the east wing. The house was undergoing renovations at the time. It was relatively simple to seal up a section of wall, to make it appear as though it had always been part of the original design. And no one ever questioned Richard's disappearance? William asks, his logical mind struggling with the implausibility of such a perfect crime. James circulated the story that Richard had left for America after their disagreement. He even went so far as to forge letters, supposedly from Richard, which arrived from New York at carefully spaced intervals over the next few years. Eventually, the letters stopped coming, and James informed the family that his brother had succumbed to yellow fever. But if this is true, Charlotte says slowly, why is Richard's spirit appearing now, after all these years? And why in the mirror? Eleanor turns to Edward. This mirror hung in the drawing room on the day of the murder. According to your father, Richard's last moments were reflected in its surface. Perhaps something of him remained. This is preposterous, Edward says, but without conviction. Even if this fanciful tale is true, ghosts do not exist. There must be another explanation for what we're seeing. As if in response to his skepticism, the mirror on the wall begins to vibrate slightly, a low hum emanating from its frame. The reflection within the glass distorts, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Father, William says urgently, I think we should leave this room. Edward is about to agree when Eleanor steps forward once more, her hand outstretched toward the mirror. No, she says firmly. We need to understand what he wants, why he's revealing himself now, after all this time. Eleanor, this is dangerous, Edward protests, moving to pull his wife away from the mirror. But before he can reach her, the glass of the mirror suddenly clouds over, as if breathed upon in cold weather. When it clears, the reflection it shows is no longer of the drawing room and its occupants. Instead, the Blackwoods find themselves looking at the same room, but as it might have appeared decades earlier. The furniture is arranged differently. the wallpaper a pattern that had been replaced long before Edward was born. And in the center of this spectral drawing room from the past stand two men in heated argument. Though the image is silent, it's clear from their gestures and expressions that their exchange is volatile, filled with anger and accusation. "James and Richard," Eleanor whispers. The Blackwoods watch, transfixed, as the scene plays out in the mirror. James Blackwood, a bear of a man with a full beard, grows increasingly agitated as his slighter, clean-shaven brother continues speaking, his finger jabbing the air to emphasize his points. Suddenly, James lunges for the fireplace, grasping the poker. Richard backs away, hands raised defensively, but he's too slow. James swings the poker, connecting with Richard's temple. Richard crumples to the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Rose lets out a cry of distress, and William quickly covers her eyes, though he himself cannot look away from the macabre scene. In the mirror, James Blackwood stands over his brother's body, the poker still clutched in his hand, his expression one of shock and horror at what he has done. He drops to his knees, feeling for a pulse, but it's clear from his subsequent reaction that he finds none. He rises, paces the room in obvious panic, then goes to the door, calling for someone. A servant appears, an older man, gray-haired and solemn-faced. The two men converse briefly, the servant's initial shock giving way to a grim determination. Together, they lift Richard's body and carry it from the room. The scene in the mirror shifts, showing a different part of the house, a corridor in the east wing where renovations are underway. The walls are partially open, revealing the wooden framework beneath. James and the servant lay Richard's body in a hollow space within the wall. The servant begins to close up the opening while James watches, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Then the image fades, the mirror's surface rippling once more before returning to its normal state, reflecting only the 5 pale faces of the Blackwood family. For a long moment, no one speaks. The only sound in the drawing room is the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the ragged breathing of the Blackwoods as they struggle to process what they have witnessed. "It was not a story," Eleanor says at last. "It was the truth. Richard Blackwood was murdered by his brother, and his body concealed within these very walls." Edward sinks into an armchair, his legs no longer able to support him. "My grandfather, a murderer," he murmurs, the weight of this revelation crushing down upon him. Charlotte moves to her father's side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Father, you cannot blame yourself for the actions of a man you never knew." "But I have benefited from his crime," Edward says bitterly. "This house, the family fortune, such as remains of it, all of it should have been divided with Richard, or passed to his descendants had he lived to have any. Is that why his spirit appears now?" William asks, still holding Rose protectively. "Some form of justice? Retribution?" Eleanor shakes her head slowly. "I don't think so. The timing is too specific. He appeared in our photograph, made himself known to us now for a reason." As if in response to her words, the lamps in the room flicker once more, and a cold draft sweeps through the drawing room, causing the curtains to billow through the windows are closed. The mirror begins to vibrate again, more violently this time, rattling against the wall. "What's happening?" Charlotte gasps, backing away from the mirror, pulling her father with her. The surface of the glass darkens, as if a shadow has fallen across it. Then, letter by letter, words begin to appear, as though being written by an invisible finger on the clouded surface. "Find me. He wants us to find his remains," Eleanor says, her voice hushed with realization. "To give him a proper burial. After all this time? It's been over 40 years. Edward objects, but weakly. The evidence before his eyes is becoming increasingly difficult to deny or explain away through rational means. "His soul cannot rest," Eleanor insists. "He was murdered, denied justice, his body hidden away like so much rubbish. Of course he cannot rest." William, ever practical despite the extraordinary circumstances, asks, "But how are we to find him? The east wing is extensive, and if the wall was sealed professionally, it would be indistinguishable from any other." The words on the mirror fade, replaced by new ones. "Follow the cold." What does that mean? Charlotte wonders aloud. Rose, who has been silent throughout most of this horrifying revelation, suddenly speaks up. "I know. I've felt it before." All eyes turn to the young girl as she continues. "Sometimes when I'm playing in the East Wing, there are cold spots, places where it feels like winter, even on the warmest days." Edward exchanges a glance with Eleanor. "Rose, why didn't you mention this before?" The child shrugs. I thought all old houses had cold spots. Miss Pemberton says it's just drafts. Miss Pemberton is usually right, William says. But in this case, I think you've observed something significant, Rosie. The presence of a spirit is often associated with localized drops in temperature. You've been reading those spiritualist pamphlets again, Charlotte accuses her brother. Knowledge is never wasted, William replies defensively. And in this instance, it may prove useful. Edward rises from his chair, a new determination in his bearing. Very well. If we are to put this matter to rest, quite literally, it seems, then we shall investigate these cold spots. Rose, can you show us where you felt them? Rose nods, her initial fear giving way to a sense of importance at being taken seriously by the adults. Yes, father. Then let us proceed, Edward says, reaching for the lamp nearest to him. Charlotte, bring another lamp. William, fetch a tool from the gardener's shed, something we can use to open a wall if necessary. As the family prepares to leave the drawing room, Eleanor casts one last glance at the mirror. The words have faded, but there is still a presence there, a darkness lurking behind the glass. We will find you, she promises quietly, and we will set things right. The east wing of Blackwood Manor is the oldest part of the house, dating back to the original construction in the late 17th century. Over the years, various renovations and additions have altered its internal layout, creating a somewhat labyrinthine series of corridors, rooms, and alcoves. It is less frequently used than the main part of the house, with several rooms closed off to save on heating and maintenance. Rose leads the family down the main corridor of the east wing, her small face serious with concentration. The adults follow, Edward and William carrying lamps, Charlotte keeping close to her mother, who seems to grow more agitated with each step deeper into the wing. There, Rose says suddenly, stopping before a section of wall between two bedchambers. This is one of the places. It's always cold here. Edward holds his lamp closer to the wall. It appears unremarkable. The same wallpaper as the rest of the corridor, the same wainscoting below. He reaches out to touch the surface, and indeed, the wall is noticeably cooler than it should be. There's nothing unusual to see, he says, frowning. No seams or irregularities that would suggest a concealed opening. William steps forward, examining the wall more closely. The renovation would have been thorough. James wouldn't have risked a discovery by leaving any obvious signs. He taps the wall at various points, listening to the sound it makes. It sounds solid enough. Are there other cold spots, Rose? Charlotte asks. The girl nods, pointing further down the corridor. Near the old nursery, and in the small sitting room at the end of the hall. Let's check them all, Edward decides. As they continue their investigation, the atmosphere in the east wing grows increasingly oppressive. The air seems thicker, harder to breathe, and the lamplight doesn't reach as far as it should, the darkness pressing in from all sides. More than once, one of them turns suddenly, convinced they've seen movement at the corner of their eye, only to find nothing there. The second cold spot, near the nursery, yields no more clues than the first. But as they approach the small sitting room at the end of the hall, Eleanor suddenly stops, her hand flying to her throat. What is it? Edward asks, concerned by his wife's pallor. He's here, she whispers. I can feel him. As if confirming her words, the lamps flicker violently, nearly extinguishing before stabilizing at a lower intensity. The temperature in the corridor drops precipitously, their breath visible as small clouds in the chilled air. Rose presses close to William, shivering. It's colder than before, she says. The sitting room, Eleanor says, her voice distant. That's where we need to look. The small sitting room is rarely used these days. Once a cozy retreat for the ladies of the house, it has become little more than a storage space, housing furniture that has fallen out of fashion but is too valuable to discard. Dust sheets cover most pieces, giving the room a ghostly appearance in the wavering lamplight. As soon as they enter, it becomes apparent that this cold spot is different from the others. The drop in temperature is more severe, turning their breath to frost in the air. The lamps struggle to stay lit, the flames shrinking to mere pinpoints. It's here, Eleanor says with certainty. Somewhere in this room. William sets his lamp on a covered table and begins to examine the walls methodically, tapping and listening, looking for any inconsistency. Charlotte and Rose help him, working their way around the perimeter of the room. Edward watches them for a moment, then turns to his wife. Eleanor, how did you know about Richard? About what really happened to him? She meets his gaze steadily. Your father told me on his deathbed. He was delirious with fever, talking as if to Richard himself, begging forgiveness for his father's sin and his own complicity in maintaining the lie. I didn't understand at first, but later, when I found the miniature portrait of Richard in your father's effects, I began to piece it together. Why didn't you tell me? Edward asks, hurt evident in his voice. Would you have believed me? A fantastical tale of murder and concealment based on the ravings of a dying man? Eleanor shakes her head. I wasn't even certain I believed it myself, until now. Their conversation is interrupted by William's excited call. Father, come look at this. Edward and Eleanor hurry to where William is kneeling beside a section of wainscoting near the fireplace. The woodwork here is different, William explains, running his fingers along the border. Slightly newer than the rest, the style not quite matching. And listen, he taps the wall above, and instead of the solid sound they heard elsewhere, there's a hollowness to it. It's what's behind the wall that matters, Edward says, examining the area. If there's a body there, we need to open it, Eleanor insists. It's the only way to know for certain. William retrieves the tool he brought from the garden shed, a small crowbar. Where should I start? Edward considers the wall, then points to where the wainscoting meets the plaster above. There. Try to get the edge of the crowbar in that seam. William positions the crowbar and applies pressure. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, with a creak of protest, the wood begins to give way. Encouraged, William works the crowbar deeper, leveraging against the wall with all his strength. Suddenly, with a sharp crack, a section of the wainscoting breaks free. William stumbles backward, nearly falling. A rush of stale, musty air escapes from the opening, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of decay. Charlotte gags, covering her mouth and nose. That smell! Rose, go back to the main house, Edward commands, his voice brooking no argument. Find Mrs. Harper and tell her to prepare some tea in the kitchen. Wait there until we come for you. For once, Rose doesn't protest, clearly relieved to have a reason to leave the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the sitting room. She hurries away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Once she's gone, William uses the crowbar to widen the opening in the wall. The wood splinters and breaks away in chunks, revealing a dark cavity beyond. Edward holds his lamp closer, trying to see what lies within. At first, there appears to be nothing but a hollow space, a void between the walls. But as more of the wainscoting is removed, a shape becomes visible in the darkness, the unmistakable form of human remains. Charlotte turns away, unable to look. Eleanor steps closer, her face a mask of grim determination. Edward holds the lamp steady, illuminating the grisly discovery. The body has largely decomposed over the decades, leaving primarily skeletal remains, but scraps of clothing still cling to the bones, the remnants of what was once a fine suit, now faded and rotted. And around the skull, which is turned at an unnatural angle, is a dark stain on the wooden framework, the dried blood from the fatal blow. Richard Blackwood, Edward says quietly. My great-uncle. William continues to work, enlarging the opening in the wall. We need to remove him, he says, his scholarly detachment helping him maintain composure. Give him a proper burial, as Mother said. As the opening grows large enough to access the remains, a curious object catches the lamplight, something clutched in the skeletal fingers of the right hand. Eleanor is the first to notice. There's something there, she says, pointing. In his hand. Edward leans closer, directing the light. It looks like a locket. William carefully reaches into the cavity, his movements slow and respectful. With gentle fingers, he extracts the object from the bony grasp. It is indeed a locket, a small, oval-shaped pendant on a tarnished chain. The metal is dull with age, but it appears to be gold or a similar precious metal. Open it, Eleanor urges. William hesitates, then carefully pries open the locket. Inside are two miniature portraits, faded but still discernible. One is of a young woman with dark hair and delicate features. The other is of Richard himself, looking much as he did in the spectral image they witnessed in the mirror. He had a sweetheart, Charlotte says softly, looking over William's shoulder. More than that, perhaps, Eleanor suggests, examining the portraits. Look at the inscription. Inside the locket, engraved in tiny letters, are the words, Richard and Emma, 1862, forever bound. Emma, Edward repeats, the name stirring a vague memory. I believe there was an Emma Harrington mentioned in some of the old family correspondence. She was engaged to Richard, according to my father. What happened to her after Richard disappeared? Charlotte asks. Edward shakes his head. I don't know. The Harringtons moved away from the area shortly after, as I recall. She never knew what really happened to him, William says, a note of sadness in his voice. She probably spent years wondering, hoping for his return. A heavy silence falls over the room as they contemplate this additional tragedy. Not just a man murdered, but a love story cut short. A woman left to wonder and grieve without closure. The moment is broken by a sudden gust of cold air that sweeps through the sitting room, extinguishing both lamps and plunging them into darkness. Charlotte gasps. William mutters a startled exclamation, and Edward fumbles for the matches in his pocket. Before he can relight the lamps, a faint glow begins to emanate from the opening in the wall. A soft, bluish light that illuminates the skeletal remains of Richard Blackwood. The light grows stronger, pulsing gently, then seems to gather itself, coalescing into a more defined shape above the bones. Gradually, the luminous form takes on human features, the spectral apparition of Richard Blackwood, the same gaunt figure they saw in the mirror. His expression is solemn but no longer angry or threatening. He looks at each of the living Blackwoods in turn, his gaze lingering longest on William, who bears the strongest resemblance to him of all the family members. Then Richard's ghost turns his attention to the locket in William's hand. He reaches out, his translucent fingers passing through the physical object, a gesture of longing and remembrance. "He wants us to find her," Eleanor says softly. "Emma, to let her know what happened to him." The apparition nods slowly, confirming Eleanor's intuition. "But it's been over 40 years. Edward objects. "If she still lives, she would be an old woman now." The ghost of Richard Blackwood makes a sweeping gesture with his arm, and suddenly, the air before him seems to ripple and change, forming a new image. A country house, modest but well kept, surrounded by gardens. The vision is like a window into another place, showing the house in clear detail, down to the name on the gate, Rose Hill Cottage. "Is that where she is?" Charlotte asks, her voice hushed with awe. "Rose Hill Cottage?" The apparition nods again, then points to the locket once more. "He wants us to take it to her," William understands, "to return it, along with the truth." Richard's ghost bows his head in acknowledgement, then turns back to the opening in the wall, to the remains of his earthly body. He makes a gesture of gathering, of collecting, then points toward the window, toward the family cemetery on the grounds of Blackwood Manor. "And he wants a proper burial," Edward says, "in the family plot." The apparition's expression softens, a look of gratitude passing over his spectral features. Then, slowly, the glowing form begins to fade, the blue light diminishing until only darkness remains. Edward strikes a match with shaking hands, relighting one of the lamps. In its warm glow, the sitting room looks ordinary once more, save for the gaping hole in the wall and the skeletal remains visible within. "Well," he says, his voice steadier than he feels, "it seems we have our instructions. William, Charlotte, help me gather him. Eleanor, could you send for the vicar? We'll need his assistance for the burial." As they set about their grim task, a sense of purpose replaces the fear that had gripped them earlier. They are no longer simply confronting a supernatural phenomenon. They are righting a historical wrong, bringing peace to a troubled spirit, and perhaps, in some small way, atoning for the sins of their ancestor. The burial takes place the following day, a private affair attended only by the Blackwood family and the vicar, who asks no questions about the sudden need to enter the recently discovered remains of a long-lost relative. The day is overcast but not raining, a somber gray sky providing a fitting backdrop to the solemn ceremony. As the plain coffin is lowered into the freshly dug grave, Eleanor places a single white rose on its lid. "Rest in peace, Richard Blackwood," she murmurs. "May you find in death the justice you were denied in life." The vicar speaks the traditional words of committal, his voice carrying across the small family cemetery. When the service concludes and the grave is filled, the Blackwoods stand in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. It is William who finally speaks. "We still need to find Emma Harrington to fulfill our promise." Edward nods. "I've made inquiries. There is indeed a Rose Hill Cottage in Hampshire. It belongs to a Mrs. Emma Webster, her married name presumably. I've written to her, requesting permission to visit on a matter concerning the Blackwood family." "And if she agrees to see us?" Charlotte asks. "Then we shall go to her," Edward says simply. "All of us. We owe her the truth and Richard his final request." 2 weeks later, the Blackwood family travels to Hampshire in Edward's recently acquired automobile, a necessary extravagance for a journey of such distance. The countryside rolls past the windows, lush and green in the early summer sunshine. Rose presses her face to the glass, delighted by the novel experience of motorized travel. William consults a map, directing his father at each crossroads. Charlotte and Eleanor sit quietly, the locket safely tucked in Eleanor's reticule. Rose Hill Cottage proves to be exactly as they saw it in Richard's spectral vision. A charming country house with extensive gardens, not grand but comfortable and well-maintained. As the automobile pulls up to the gate, a gardener looks up from his work, eyeing the vehicle with curiosity. "Blackwood family to see Mrs. Webster," Edward informs him. "We're expected." The gardener nods and opens the gate, allowing them to proceed up the gravel drive to the house. A maid greets them at the door, showing them into a pleasant drawing room where sunlight streams through lace curtains, illuminating furnishings that speak of modest wealth and refined taste. "Mrs. Webster will be with you shortly," the maid informs them, before withdrawing. They wait in nervous silence, each wondering how they will explain their strange errand to a woman who has lived for decades not knowing the truth about her lost love. Finally, the door opens, and Emma Webster enters the room. Despite being in her 70s, she carries herself with dignity and grace. Her hair is silver now, her face lined with age, but there is still a beauty about her, echoes of the young woman from the locket portrait. Her eyes, a striking blue, are sharp and inquisitive as they sweep over the Blackwood family. "Edward Blackwood," she says, her voice stronger than her years might suggest. "You look like your father." Edward bows slightly. "Mrs. Webster, thank you for receiving us. May I present my wife, Eleanor, my daughters Charlotte and Rose, and my son William." Emma acknowledges each with a nod, then gestures to the seats arranged around the room. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. Your letter mentioned a matter concerning the Blackwood family that might be of interest to me. I confess, I was intrigued. It has been many years since I had any connection to the Blackwoods." As they take their seats, Edward struggles with how to begin. How does one explain such an incredible story to a rational person? How does one speak of ghosts and murder to a woman who has lived a life built on a foundation of lies? Eleanor, sensing her husband's difficulty, takes the initiative. "Mrs. Webster, what we have to tell you may seem incredible, even impossible, but I assure you it is the truth, as we have come to understand it." Emma's expression remains composed, but her hands, resting in her lap, tighten slightly. "Go on." Eleanor glances at Edward, who nods for her to continue. "It concerns Richard Blackwood." At the mention of that name, Emma's carefully maintained composure falters. A shadow passes over her face, a brief glimpse of old pain. "Richard disappeared over 40 years ago. He went to America, or so I was told. He never wrote to me, never sent word." Her voice trails off, old wounds reopened. "That is what the Blackwood family claimed," Eleanor says gently, "but it was not the truth." Over the next half hour, Eleanor tells the story of Richard's fate, the argument with his brother, the fatal blow, the concealment of his body, and the decades of silence that followed. She speaks of the ghostly apparition in the mirror, the discovery of Richard's remains, and his final request that they find Emma and tell her the truth. Throughout the account, Emma sits perfectly still, her face a mask of control, though tears gather in her eyes and occasionally spill down her cheeks. She does not interrupt, does not question, simply listens with an intensity that suggests she is absorbing every word, measuring it against her own memories and suspicions. When Eleanor finishes, the room falls silent. Even Rose, who has been fidgeting throughout, seems to understand the gravity of the moment and remains still. Finally, Emma speaks, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always knew he wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Not Richard. He was many things, but never cruel." She looks directly at Edward. "Your grandfather told me Richard had left suddenly, that something urgent had called him away. Later there were letters, supposedly from New York, but the handwriting, it wasn't quite right, and the sentiments expressed, they didn't sound like my Richard." "You suspected?" William asks. Emma nods slowly. "I suspected, but could prove nothing. What could I do? The Blackwoods were powerful in those days. Who would have believed a young woman from a family of lesser standing?" She pauses, gathering herself. "In time, I married Mr. Webster. He was a good man, kind and patient. We had a good life together, but I never forgot Richard." Eleanor opens her reticule and carefully withdraws the locket. "We found this with him," she says, extending it toward Emma. "He was holding it when he died." Emma's hand trembles as she reaches for the locket. When her fingers close around it, a small sob escapes her. "I gave this to him on our last night together," she says, her voice breaking. "Before I left for London to visit my aunt. I never saw him again." She opens the locket, gazing at the twin portraits inside. her younger self and the man she had loved so long ago, forever bound. She reads the inscription, her finger tracing the tiny engraved letters. We were to be married that autumn. Mrs. Webster, William says hesitantly, there's something else. Richard's spirit. He guided us to you. He wanted you to know the truth, to have the locket returned to you. Emma looks up from the locket, her eyes shining with tears. You've seen him? Spoken with him? Not spoken exactly, William explains, but he communicated his wishes. He showed us your house, led us to his remains, asked us to find you. And has he found peace now? Emma asks, her voice catching. Eleanor and Edward exchange a glance. We believe he has, Eleanor says carefully. Since the proper burial, there have been no further manifestations. The mirror is just a mirror once more. Emma closes her eyes briefly, her fingers still clutching the locket. When she opens them again, there is a calm acceptance in her gaze. Thank you, she says simply, for bringing me the truth, for bringing him back to me, in a way. As the Blackwoods prepare to leave, Emma walks with them to the door. The afternoon has taken on a golden quality, the sunlight warm and gentle on the garden. At the threshold, Emma places a hand on Edward's arm. Your grandfather did a terrible thing, she says, her voice quiet but steady. But you have done a good thing, you and your family. You have brought closure not just to Richard's spirit, but to mine as well. Edward bows his head. It was the least we could do. The sins of the past cast long shadows. But shadows fade in the light of truth, Emma replies. She looks at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering on William. You resemble him, you know. Richard, the same thoughtful eyes. William blushes slightly at the comparison. I'm honored by the connection. As they bid their farewells and walk back to the automobile, a sense of completeness settles over the Blackwood family. The burden they have carried since discovering the truth about Richard has lightened, replaced by the satisfaction of having done what was right, of having brought peace to two souls separated by violence and deceit. The journey back to Blackwood Manor is quieter than the outward trip, each family member lost in their own reflections on the day's events. As the countryside slips past the windows, Eleanor reaches for Edward's hand, squeezing it gently. What happens now? She asks softly. Edward considers the question. We go on, he says simply. With the truth acknowledged, the past put to rest, we rebuild what James Blackwood damaged with his act of violence, not just a life, but the integrity of our family name. Upon their return to Blackwood Manor, they find the house peaceful, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long now lifted. The drawing room, once the scene of their supernatural encounter, feels ordinary once more, just a room with furniture and a mirror that reflects only what stands before it. That evening, after dinner, Edward calls his family together in his study. He has spent the afternoon reviewing the family's financial papers, coming to terms with their precarious situation. I believe it's time for honesty in all matters, he tells them, spreading the papers on his desk. Our financial situation is worse than I've admitted. The investments in coal have continued to decline. If we are to preserve Blackwood Manor for future generations, we must adapt to the changing times. William leans forward, interested. What do you propose, Father? The future lies in electricity, in automobiles, in progress, Edward says, warming to his topic. I've been too resistant to change, too committed to the old ways. That ends now. I'm considering selling a portion of our land, the less productive acres, and investing the proceeds in more promising ventures. Charlotte looks concerned. Sell Blackwood land? Father, that's been in our family for generations. And what good is land if we cannot maintain it? Edward counters. Better to sacrifice a part to save the whole. Besides, there's something liberating about facing the truth of our situation. No more pretense, no more living beyond our means to keep up appearances. Eleanor smiles at her husband, proud of his newfound resolve. I agree, and perhaps it's time I contributed more directly as well. My watercolors have received some interest from the gallery in town. It's not a fortune, but it's something. Edward returns her smile, reaching across the desk to take her hand. Every little helps, my dear. As the family continues to discuss their plans for the future, a sense of optimism pervades the room, a feeling that has been absent from Blackwood Manor for too long. The revelation of Richard's fate, though shocking and painful, has broken a cycle of secrets and denial that had poisoned the family for generations. Later that night, as the house sleeps, a gentle breeze stirs the curtains in the drawing room. Moonlight spills across the floor, illuminating the old mirror above the mantelpiece. For a brief moment, if anyone had been there to see it, they might have glimpsed two reflections in the glass, a man and a woman, young and in love, their figures translucent in the silver light. Richard and Emma, together at last, if only in the liminal space between worlds. The figures fade as the moonlight shifts, leaving only the ordinary reflection of an empty room. But there is a peace to the emptiness now, a sense of completion. The mirror that once trapped a restless spirit now holds only memories, and Blackwood Manor, freed from the burden of its dark secret, can finally move forward into the light of a new day. 6 months later, the Blackwood family gathers once more in the drawing room. The house has changed subtly in the intervening period, some of the heavier Victorian furnishings replaced with lighter, more modern pieces, electric lighting installed in the main rooms, the atmosphere altogether brighter and more welcoming. Edward stands before the mantelpiece, addressing his assembled family. "I've received word from Mrs. Webster," he tells them. "She passed peacefully in her sleep last night." The news is met with solemn nods. Though they had only met Emma once, they feel connected to her through their shared experience, through the part they played in bringing her closure in her final months. "She left something for us," Edward continues, holding up an envelope. "Her solicitor delivered it this morning." He opens the envelope carefully, extracting a folded letter and a small, familiar object, the locket that once belonged to Richard Blackwood. Eleanor gasps softly. She's returned it. Edward unfolds the letter and begins to read aloud. "To the Blackwood family, if you are reading this, I have departed this world. Do not grieve for me, for I go willingly to a reunion long delayed. The locket you returned to me has been my comfort these past months, a tangible connection to Richard and to the truth you so kindly shared. Now I wish it to return to Blackwood Manor, to remain with the family that finally brought justice to its rightful owner. Display it, if you will, as a reminder, not of the tragedy that occurred, but of the healing that followed, of the power of truth to mend what lies broken, even across the span of decades. I have seen him these past nights. Richard, as young and handsome as he was in 1863, he stands by my bedside, waiting patiently. Soon I will take his hand, and we will go together to whatever awaits beyond this life, forever bound, as we always were. With deepest gratitude, Emma Webster." A hushed silence falls over the drawing room as Edward finishes reading. Charlotte wipes a tear from her cheek. William stares thoughtfully at the locket in his father's hand. Rose, now 10 and beginning to understand more of the world's complexities, leans against her mother's side. "What shall we do with it?" Charlotte finally asks, nodding toward the locket. Edward considers for a moment, then walks to the mirror above the mantelpiece. With deliberate movements, he hangs the locket from a small hook on the frame, positioning it so that it catches the light. "Here," he says, "where it all began. A reminder, as Emma said, not of darkness, but of redemption." The family gathers around, looking at their reflections in the mirror. 5 Blackwoods, united by blood and by the journey they have taken together. The locket gleams against the gilt frame, a small but powerful symbol of truth revealed, of justice served, of peace restored. And if, occasionally in the years that follow, a visitor to Blackwood Manor reports catching a glimpse of a 6th figure in that mirror, a tall, slender man with thoughtful eyes, the family neither confirms nor denies the possibility. Some secrets, after all, are not burdens to be shed, but mysteries to be honored, connections to a past that, though flawed, has shaped the present and illuminated the path to the future. In 1905, a family posed for a photograph, and a mirror reflected 6 people instead of 5. In revealing this discrepancy, a truth long buried came to light, setting free not only a restless spirit, but also the living who had unknowingly carried the weight of his unresolved fate. The photograph that was meant to document a moment in time instead became a bridge between worlds, a catalyst for healing, and a testament to the enduring power of love and truth across the boundaries of life and death. As for the mirror that started it all, it remains in Blackwood Manor to this day, ordinary to all appearances. But those with keen eyes and open hearts might notice how the glass sometimes catches the light in unusual ways, how reflections occasionally shift when no one is moving, how the locket that hangs from its frame sometimes swings gently without the touch of a breeze. Some say it's merely the settling of an old house, the natural movement of air currents, the tricks that light plays on aged glass. Others wonder if perhaps the boundaries between worlds grow thin in certain places, if some connections are too strong to be severed even by death. The Blackwoods themselves offer no definitive answers. They simply maintain the mirror with special care, polish the locket regularly, and share knowing smiles when visitors comment on the strangely peaceful atmosphere of the drawing room, as if, somehow, it is a place where reconciliation has occurred, where what was broken has been mended, where love, in its most enduring form, has triumphed over time and tragedy alike. And in quiet moments, when the house is still and moonlight spills across the floor, they sometimes stand before that mirror and whisper words of gratitude to Richard and Emma, whose story changed their own, and to the photograph that revealed not just a spectral presence, but the power of truth to set both the living and the dead free at last.